Okay, hello and welcome to the 8:30 live, because it's 8:30. No, it's not raining outside. I just took a shower because I was doing yoga, and that's why my hair is wet. And it will continue to get increasingly dry as the show goes on, but, whatever. A guy's got to do yoga, right? You got to stay healthy in this coronavirus land. Can't really go outside and run around like I normally do. Oof. And, anyway, I forgot. I got to do the sharing. The Facebook page while people jump in, and now people are jumping in because hey Simon, how's it going? Because I completely neglected to load up this page. Oh no. Okay. In any event, just to give everybody a little taste of what we're going to be talking about tonight, it's all going to be about race, unfortunately. That's what's in the news. That's what I was asked to talk about last night with regards to the school system. So this should be a pretty interesting conversation. But before we get to these really, really sensitive topics of race and race relations in the United States, I did want to point out a few things that came up today that are a bit more lighthearted. Of course, almost anything's more lighthearted than race relations in the United States, but I did want to point them out. First, in a new step, Twitter has decided to fact check tweets. And so they slapped their first fact check on the president today. And that caused Donald Trump to, of course, excoriate the social media platform for trying to meddle in the 2020 election. But ultimately, Donald Trump tweeted something that was misleading or false, and Twitter labeled it as such. Now, while it is cool that Twitter is now letting folks know when the president tweets something that is not true or hasn't been verified, I do want to go back and talk just for a brief second about the fact that the social media platforms are setting themselves up to be the arbiters of truth. And ultimately, in an absolute sense, I think that's pretty bad. It's not great that we're going to have corporations deciding what people perceive as true and what people perceive as false, particularly things that are limited to, say, 240 characters, where there's almost no capacity to portray nuance. Now, I did read Twitter's blog post on their policy, which is really, really scarce on details. Essentially, they don't describe how they're going to determine what's true and false. And on top of that, they've put forward a rubric of levels or degrees of falseness. So one is misleading, one is disputed, and one is unverified. Now, these are somewhat self-explanatory, but basically there are posts where there's conflicting information or people disagree on whether or not it's true. There are posts which are demonstrably or have been decided to be untrue or misleading. And then there are ones where there's no information available for Twitter to make a determination as to whether it's true or not. However, as we've seen on Facebook, this doesn't really stop a platform from deciding how to determine what is true and what is false. So, for example, I think I spoke about this, but I can't remember anymore. Certainly, I posted a big thread on Facebook about this, but I shared an article from Vice about the bill in Congress to reauthorize FISA. And in that legislation was an amendment that was defeated to remove a component that would authorize the government to search your internet history without a warrant. Now, I shared this Vice article, and I also provided a bunch of context around that Vice article, but Facebook labeled it as partially false. And so they decided then that they would reduce distribution of that post. And this is for anybody else who shared that article, I suppose. They would reduce distribution of that post, and then they would promote distribution to my network of things that they deemed to be accurate. And the source that they cited in response to the post that I shared was a USA Today article. Now, the differences between what I wrote, the commentary I gave on the Vice piece, and what was in the USA Today article was really two things. The first was that I said this was a problem and that it was a big deal that the amendment hadn't been passed, removing this provision. The USA Today article said that this is not out of the ordinary, and it doesn't really matter that the amendment didn't pass. So the main point was you disagree that this is an important aspect of the bill. And the second component was that the bill hadn't actually passed. It had been sent back to the House, but I had called that out. Now, the reason I think this is such a problematic situation is not because, oh, this article is just so important that everybody needs to see it, or I was called a liar by Facebook. That's not the situation. You know, it was labeled partially false, and like, I don't really care on this particular issue. The reality, but the problem is that they didn't really read what I wrote. I shared something. They had decided ahead of time that that was going to be a false thing, and then they just went around labeling things as false or true. And this is very dangerous because without any context, it's impossible to refute or actually pass on correct information. So Twitter now is doing the same thing. They are providing links to sources that they vet and verify, so they're Twitter true. And then when you're presented with something they deem as misleading, they will direct you to something that they deem as correct. Now, this is, you know, in theory, a way of getting facts into the hands of folks who are on a social media platform. But at the end of the day, it just sets up an echo chamber of corporations that determine amongst themselves who is actually reporting truth and who is not reporting truth. So I find this to be an interesting development, but rather disturbing. And somebody asked, what would I want Facebook to do? What would I want Twitter to do? And I can tell you right now exactly what I would like to see, particularly from Facebook. And that is, instead of labeling things false or not false, I'd like to see them label things as disputed. And if they want to fact check, which I think would be fantastic, Facebook could do fact checking. What I'd like to see is them hiring people to read posts and then respond directly to those posts with their points as to why they think this thing is false or misleading. And that would allow for transparency and would allow for posters to come back and share with their networks their rebuttals to the Facebook points. Now, does that seem unscalable? Does that seem like a ridiculous amount of work? Yes, it does. Does it sound like it would cost a lot of money to hire these people? Yeah, but really, who gives a shit? Because Facebook is a multi-billion-dollar company. What are we saying? Like, oh, this would cost like $2 billion to hire all these people? Well, who cares? So what? It's completely feasible, and it's a much more considerate and intelligent way to do fact checking. The only problem is it impacts the social media platform's bottom line too much. But that's how you fact check. You get people who can read and do research to come in and provide point by point rebuttals and rationales as to why something should be deemed misleading, so that there can be a dialogue. Even if they don't respond to a post, even if they don't respond to somebody's response, that would be fine. At least you'd be able to lay the debate on the table and lay facts, and people could cite their sources. That would actually encourage folks to do research. It would encourage folks to produce evidence instead of just letting corporations decide through algorithms whether or not they're going to let something be true or not, or let something be debatable or not. So that was a minor, well, I suppose it's not so minor. It was a really big step forward in Twitter's policies around information sharing, and the first sign that they've made that they're going to start limiting or moderating discourse on their platform that isn't straight up hate speech. So I thought that was pretty big. And then, you know, one more Twitter anecdote. Donald Trump went on Twitter today, or maybe it was yesterday, to just yell about the fact that there's a double standard because Obama went golfing last weekend and he went golfing last weekend and nobody's upset at Obama. And really, there is a double standard. There are two different standards for people who are president and people who aren't president. And it's just ridiculous, isn't it? Why can't the president just be treated like a regular schlub who doesn't have any responsibility to the American people? Great question, Donald. Absolutely fucking fantastic. All right, so that takes us out of sort of the easy things to talk about. Now we've got to talk. Oh, wait, actually, we'll do the comments and then we're going to talk about race because there are two big stories about race relations that came out in the last 48 hours, back to back, really. And then last night I was asked to talk about an op-ed regarding the New York City public school system, which really, as well, is centered around the debate of race relations, just happens to be in the context of New York City and our segregated education system. But let's see the comments on the Twitter stuff and the social media stuff, and then we'll get into what I'm sure is going to be a very comment-heavy section. But, you know, fantastic stuff. It's good. We should debate. I mean, that's what we're here for. Simon Sachs. Hi, Ben. Hello, Simon. How am I? I'm doing well, thanks. Dorian Key. Hi, Ben. Hello, Dorian. Dorian as well. We should be like France and make race non-existent in law. Well, it is to say that they... Oh, my God. Okay, we'll get into it after we get... once we cover the social media comments, because whether or not we should explicitly address race in law is another huge component of what makes up the race relations dynamics here in the United States. Things like affirmative action, the debate over reparations, how police forces are organized. My goodness, so much in there. So, Simon Sachs, you should appeal Facebook's decision. There needs to be an elected peer review advisory council or an alternative distribution resolution process. The answer to that comment is I did not see any way to appeal that decision on my post, so I did not appeal. I do know that Facebook appointed the Arbiters of Truth, which is their high council of truth deciders. It happens, you know, it contains like a Nobel Peace Prize winner and blah, blah, blah. But I don't care. Like, I don't think there should be a high council of truth at Facebook. This would be like if they're, you know, Facebook is one of the main ways people get any and all information. And to have a high council of truth is just so Orwellian. In any event, I agree that the solution is to have something that's more distributed, more good faith interaction, and allows for refutation and appeal, but in a public way that's transparent so that people can openly debate. Okay, James Morris King. However bad this is, and presuming I'm going to say this is about Facebook, and it is. Okay, there we go. However bad this is, it was also inevitable when we as a society decided to wait 30 years to start caring about how we treat information on the internet. Essentially, America decided that it was simply too politically risky for anyone with anything to lose to have... Wait, America decided that it was simply too politically risky for anyone with anything to lose to have a definitive opinion. Once left to the market, Facebook and Twitter's approach was a fait accompli. So basically, if I get you what you're saying, politicians are cowards. They're incapable of having any real position on anything because they're afraid to take a serious stance. And then given the fact that there's nothing but vagaries and looseness in our leadership, corporations were left to become the arbiters. Simon Sachs, I agree. Make a proposal to Zuckerberg, design a framework. Worst you could say is no. I'll consider it. We spoke about this in a day or two ago when we were talking about why Mark Zuckerberg supports UBI. But I am absolutely convinced, and I had this conversation with somebody, absolutely convinced that there's nothing Mark Zuckerberg cares about except his bottom line. That's why. It's because there was an article today, speaking of social media platforms, there was an article today about how Facebook chose not to, what was it? There was a problem and then they chose not to address it. I can't remember what it was, but basically, it just drove home the idea that, yes, right. Facebook did a study that demonstrated to them that Facebook breeds division and fighting on the internet, and Facebook decided to suppress that, even though there had been a commission or something that came up with solutions, because Facebook as a company makes more money when people go at each other and they breed division. So, it just says that Mark Zuckerberg has no problem watching all of us rot and ruin our lives, so long as he makes a buck out of it. So, I'm happy to send my ideas to Mark Zuckerberg. I really don't think he'll give a crap, because what I'm proposing would cost him money and maybe even reduce the appeal of Facebook because it would diminish flame wars. Camille Santasteven. Hello, Camille. It's been a while. There should be some sort of credentialing process for the fact checkers. Yes, I would agree with that. But even then, if we didn't credential the fact checkers, we would still have a situation if we were talking about a mass hiring of fact checkers, where people would have to present their counterpoints and their reasons for why they are flagging something as misleading and cite their sources. And then as long as that's transparent and the post owner could go in and debate these things, then, or, rebut those points, then at least you'd have some degree of accountability. Even though, of course, it'd be preferable to background check all the fact checkers and make sure they know what they're doing. At the very least, what we should be encouraging is transparent and open debate with citing of sources, not this voice from above model, at least in my opinion. Dorian Key, concerning race, what are your thoughts on Caucasians and Asians having 1 to 3% Neanderthal DNA, whereas people who stayed in Africa have 0%? My thoughts on that it's entirely irrelevant. It's meaningless. Like, you have about as much DNA in common with a banana as you do with another human being. Like 99.999% of all DNA is basically the same. Like these very minor. Basically, we can all catch the coronavirus, right? We all have the same strengths and weaknesses for the most part. James Morris King, replying to Dorian, hey, a hole's a hairy hole. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. Thanks, James. And James replying to Camille, this just pushes the ball of responsibility up another layer, which is to say the checking of the fact checkers doesn't get around some of the fundamental problems, which is, again, that these platforms become the arbiters of truth in our society, and it's dangerous to let centralized, particularly corporate interests, decide what we believe to be factual and not. Michael Kaplan, the bigger issue with the Central Park video. Okay, perfect segue. Thank you, Michael Kaplan. The bigger issue with the Central Park video is that many people see the police coming as a threat to people's safety. People should have the right to rightfully feel that the police coming to a scene will make a situation safer and that they will enforce the law. However, it reads that they don't and have reason to not see the police in this manner is problematic in a big way. And Julianne, with the last comment going back to Dorian's Key about interbreeding of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, I guess. I don't know. Homo habilis. I don't know what the Homo genus was at that point. But Europeans did mate with Neanderthals. It is what it is. I mean, yeah, it doesn't make a big difference. Like, what do you think of somebody who's half Asian and half white? Like, that difference in genetic structure is, it's just meaningless, really. I don't think it leads to any real difference whatsoever. I'm not a geneticist, but I certainly haven't seen any evidence of it, or scientific papers regarding differences. So I'm going to have to say that we're all pretty much the same. And again, I'm about as much human as I am banana. Okay, so let's get to the Central Park situation and the situation in Minneapolis. So as a brief recap of the situation in Central Park, and I bring this up because, this would just be news, except when I posted about it on Facebook, there were some folks who came and were questioning whether or not it was legitimate to excoriate this, one of the folks involved in this situation publicly. So let's talk about it just for a second, because, I think Michael Kaplan really, hit the nail on the head here. So basically, there was a situation in Central Park yesterday afternoon where there was a woman, her name is Amy Cooper. She was walking her dog off her leash in what's known as the Ramble. Now, the Ramble is a part of Central Park, which is, I forget exactly what its unique characteristic is, but it's for bird watching, and regardless of anything else, you are supposed to keep your dog on your leash. Like, it's set aside for that. There are other parts of the park where you can have your dog off the leash. The Ramble is not that part of the park. You're supposed to keep your dog on the leash, and it's a place for bird watchers. So this woman, who happens to be white, was walking her dog in the Ramble unleashed. So an African-American man comes up, and he asks her to leash her dog. Now, there is video of this interaction, but we don't know what happened before the video starts. And so it's very difficult. You just can't say. You can take people's word, but like, let's ignore that just for a second, because what the video shows is a woman probably a good 20 to 25 feet away from this man. He's pulled out his phone and is recording her, and she looks up and sees that he's recording her, takes her dog by the collar and starts walking, dragging the dog along, walking towards him, saying to put the camera away, asking him to stop recording. She walks up right in front of him, waves her hand in his face, and as he refuses to stop recording, she says, "I'm going to call the police," to which he responds to the effect of, "Go ahead, please do call the police." She says, "I'm going to tell them that an African-American man is threatening my life." And he says, "Please tell them whatever you want." Now, the result of this, the end result, is the police do come, but by that point, both of these people have left the scene. However, later on, this guy posts the video, I think with his sister does it, posts the video on Twitter to show this interaction. Now, the repercussions for this woman, Amy Cooper, have been swift and large. She was obviously flamed on the internet, as so many people are, but ultimately the dog, which was in the video with her, which she was shown to be dragging by the collar to go confront this man, was returned to the shelter from which she got it, and she lost her job at her financial institution. Now, the question is, why is this reaction of the internet, and why is the reaction of these institutions warranted or not? And the reality, ultimately, Amy Cooper came out with a statement which says that she apologizes and she didn't realize that this was a big deal and that she was scared. Well, I think the first thing to understand is, well, from my reading of it, and obviously you can't know somebody's mind, but she started off from a good 25 feet away. The idea that she was scared by this person asking her to leash her dog from, quite a distance, and then approaching that person to be aggressive, that doesn't indicate fear to me. But the ultimate piece here is that she called the police on this man, and it requires an understanding to appreciate why this is such a huge problem of what it means to interact with the police as a black man, particularly if somebody has said that you are threatening their life. That might imply to the police, and she made a point to say that there's an African-American man threatening my life to the dispatcher on the call. Now, there's only one reason to mention that. Sure, the police will come and they'll ask for a description of somebody if there needs to be pursuit, but it was very clear in the dialogue of the call that she was pointing out the fact that this man was black because she thought it would elicit a particular type of response from the police. Now, whether that was something that was unconscious in her or purposeful, maybe we can't know, but we can certainly know that when she told the man that she was going to call the police, she was upfront about the fact that she was going to tell them that an African-American man was threatening her life. She said that to his face, presumably in an attempt to scare him off, to get him to stop recording her, to get him to stop hassling her about her unleashed dog in the Ramble, again, where you're not supposed to have your dog unleashed. Now, all of this is really about how the police force in the United States tends to interact with African Americans, particularly black men. And this takes us to the second story, which is one of George Floyd. Now, George Floyd was in Minneapolis, and this came out this morning. Police arrested George Floyd, presumably on the crime of forgery, check forging, and a video was released of them apprehending him, having him on the ground, and one of the police putting their knee on his neck and him exclaiming that he couldn't breathe and that he was feeling pain all throughout his body. Now, for those who are unaware, the neck is a very sensitive part of the body. Basically, all of your nerves run through the neck, and it provides them with instructions from the brain. Instructions to do things like move, but also to do things like breathe and feel pain. So having a knee on your neck, particularly if the angle is bad, is extremely dangerous and hazardous to your health. As people watched and saw this man writhing or attempting to writhe around while constrained on the ground in pain, shouting that he couldn't breathe, with 3 other officers looking on, he unfortunately passed out. And when the EMTs arrived, they took him away, but he was basically a goner at that point. There wasn't, the headline, this is sort of important, I think, to point out. The headline was that, the police, he later died. Police restrain a guy and he kneels on his neck who later dies. But it's pretty clear that this is what killed him. There wasn't another thing that killed this guy. It was the police exercising absolutely zero restraint in applying all of his body weight through his knee to this guy's neck that killed him. And people looking on were pointing this out, saying, you've already got him on the ground. He's handcuffed with his hands behind his back. He's not going anywhere. He's begging you to reduce the amount of force you're applying. And the officers just could not have cared less. And then this man died. This follows, of course, a pattern that has been laid out from Michael Brown to, now I can't remember. Somebody remind me the name of the person who they put in a chokehold on Staten Island. This is in freaking New York City. Somebody help me out here. Comments. All right, no comments yet. I'm sure it'll come. James, help a brother out here. But look, ultimately, the situation is one in which, because of the history of Eric Garner, thank you, Simon. Eric Garner, Staten Island, almost the exact same situation as what we saw in Minneapolis today. Because of the history of interactions of law enforcement with black men, particularly black men who were doing nothing, but the police assumed or thought or had been told were threatening, it is effectively a threat to say you're going to call the cops on a black man, particularly if you're going to say that I will tell them that you are threatening me, that you are a physical threat and a violent threat. So this is absolutely unacceptable behavior. Whether Amy Cooper knew of this or not, really, first off, it is inexcusable to not know about it. It's inexcusable to not know about Black Lives Matter. It's inexcusable not to know about Eric Garner, about Michael Brown, all of these things. There's like a pretty long history of this, and it's not a secret. Now, I keep bringing up Eric Garner in particular because that was New York City. If you think that New York City is democratic and New York City is liberal and New York City isn't racist, you are wrong. Eric Garner was killed in New York City by a police officer who just didn't give a F. He put Eric Garner in a chokehold. Eric Garner was yelling, I can't breathe. Eric Garner wasn't going anywhere. And he held that hold until Eric Garner suffocated. So the idea that, that's somewhere else, it doesn't happen in New York City, it is a threat. It is an absolute life-endangering act to call the police on a black man and try and report that this is a dangerous, violent individual in hopes that the police will come with the desire and preparedness to use force. And even if you don't want that person dead, even if you don't think that the police are going to kill them, at the very least, you have to understand or appreciate that if you say a large African-American man is threatening my life, they're going to come and they're going to rough him up a bit. So for those folks who are questioning whether or not Amy Cooper really deserves the response that she's been getting on the internet, I can understand your desire to give somebody the benefit of the doubt, but first, you've got to watch the video for yourself. You absolutely have to see the context of what was going on, the way that she said what she said, the distance at which the conversation started, and all of these other facets which are just so integral. The next piece is it really does behoove all of us to understand just how dangerous interactions are for some segments of the population with law enforcement. And Michael was right in that nobody should have to fear the police. The police are there to serve and protect, and they're there to enforce the law, and they should be there as partners in our community. But far too often, for certain segments of the population, that's not the case. And to fail to recognize this is really to put other people's lives in danger. And if you don't actually think that your life is in danger, it is really, really unacceptable to do that to another person. If all you're having is a verbal exchange, and it's not even a particularly heated verbal exchange, then to threaten to call the cops on somebody for whom that could be a physically dangerous situation is very much uncalled for. And at this point, folks are really beside themselves with ways to get this point across. You know, you've got Colin Kaepernick kneeling and people don't accept it. You've got Black Lives Matter marches and people don't accept it. You've got videos of vigilantes killing African-American men and boys, and people don't accept that this is a problem. That is why any and all avenues for highlighting the situation seem appropriate to people who care about this. And honestly, I have to say that I would agree that in this moment, we need to get this point across somehow. And it doesn't look like your regular channels are accomplishing this. So if it takes a little bit of social media to drive the point home that you can't just call the police who show up with guns and batons and the willingness to use force, then what might be considered an extreme reaction is warranted, I think. There are lots of times when people say dumb things on the internet and they get dragged and their reputations are ruined, and it is absolutely not a proportionate response. But let's face it, what is the proportionate response to attempted murder or manslaughter? And let's just say that something like this is probably on the level of drunk driving. You wouldn't condone somebody. You wouldn't say it's okay for somebody to get liquored up and then start driving around. And if there were no law against that, if there were no way to convey that this were a problem through regular channels, you would probably launch a pretty public campaign to call out and demonstrate when people do the wrong thing. In fact, that is what Mothers Against Drunk Driving did to get substantive change on drunk driving enforcement. So that's where we are right now in the Black Lives Matter movement and criminal justice and law enforcement reform. And I agree that it really sucks that we're here. But, you know, luckily in the Central Park situation, nobody got hurt. But this morning in Minneapolis, somebody died. A few days ago in St. Louis, somebody died. I think it was St. Louis, who got, a woman, there was a no-knock warrant and they just came in and shot up the joint. People are dying all over the place and it doesn't seem like anything's breaking through. And if this is the sort of thing that gets people's attention, to some extent, you just have to accept it. Now, do I think this woman's life should be ruined forever? Again, I think it's all about proportionate, and I believe in the capacity of people to be better. I believe, and we spoke about this the other day on Joe Biden. The number one reason I think Joe Biden is better than Donald Trump is because I believe in the capacity of people to be better, particularly when they demonstrate the desire and the want and the recognition. Amy Cooper can do that. It takes time, and she's going to have to suffer her lumps for what she did. But do I think that she's written off forever? No, that doesn't have to be the case. But Donald Trump, there are people who are very, very clear that they're unrepentant, that they accept no blame, no responsibility, and that they do not think that what they did is wrong. And for situations like that, only the law, I guess an election is the law, but only the law can intervene when somebody is completely unrepentant and has no desire to make themselves a better member of society and continuously hurts others. But insofar as this moment being a teachable moment, I think it's important. That being said, I do want to say one thing to all the advocates who are watching. When I shared that post about what happened in Central Park, I did not say in my post why this was so egregious, why this woman had done something wrong. And so people came and asked the question, why are we calling this woman out when nobody got hurt? And a lot of folks will say, listen, it's not my job to educate you on this matter. And I certainly assumed that everybody on my feed would understand, but that was my mistake. As an activist and an advocate, it is my job to put things in context. It is not my job to assume that other people know the things that I know or will believe the things that I believe without me having to tell them. And I'm not offended by the fact that people ask a question. I only ask that they really listen. And it is also my job to listen to them. Now, this is not for everybody, right? There are lots of times when I walk into a space and there's a debate going on and somebody who is of a marginalized group is just like, it's not my job to explain to you why I have a right to exist. Go do your own research. Personally, I don't find that productive. However, I absolutely respect the fact that it is exhausting to constantly explain why you have a right to exist and why it is that somebody else is wrong to think that your rights should be curtailed. But that is where, that is where the activists and the advocates and the allies come in. So I changed my post to explain why this was a dangerous situation, why what this woman in Central Park did was a life-threatening action, why it's tantamount to a threat of a beating, if not a threat of murder. And then I linked back to what had happened just hours before in Minneapolis to demonstrate the point that when nonviolent Black men interact with law enforcement, it can, without, in a pretty outlander or outlier scenario, end up in severe physical harm, if not death. So the other thing I want to say about this is just for those of us who view ourselves as advocates, who view ourselves as activists, who care about this and who have the emotional strength to talk to others about this, we should do it. We must do it. It's not enough to say, watch the news for yourself. First, that's condescending. Two, it implies that they'll learn the right lesson without having any of the context that you have. And third, it makes them dislike you. And if they don't like you because you're not listening to them or because they think you're a jerk, they're not going to be receptive to your point. And that is not what we want, right? So If you're going to post about these things, I always encourage then to provide context and explain why something is the way it is, and how important it is to follow these issues, because it really impacts folks' lives. All right, let's get to some questions. Then we'll get to the education and race question in New York City. Boom, boom, boom. Deidre Levy, more people should watch Do the Right Thing. Now, there's a great Spike Lee movie. Highly endorse. James Morris King. Is it going to be long? No, it's not that long, actually. I was talking with, presumably my wife. I was talking with my wife today and had the thought that maybe we've been going about the police brutality and racism thing all wrong. Instead of fighting for all cops to have body cams and wrangling with the state cities to make that footage publicly available, maybe we should just fund free body cams for Black people. That's not a crazy idea. Obviously, Black people have a much higher incentive to catch everything on film and to release that footage after the fact. The real problem would be if the police go around killing people and then breaking the body cams so that there is no record. And, not that I want to say that the police would do such a thing, but some might. James, it would be a great political stunt to set up a, quote, free Black body cam stand at one of the entrances to Central Park. Yeah. All you need is the funding for that, for those body cameras. Julian Ballantyne, she wasn't scared. She is an entitled racist. We know she is entitled because she was walking the dog off the leash. She knew, oops, this is quite long. She knew she was not supposed to have her dog off the leash. As you said, she said multiple times that an African-American man was there. She knew what would happen if the police came looking for an African-American man. Her entitlement was threatened. Again, she was the one breaking the law, and then she called the cops on the person who really, in another situation, she probably would have been the one doing the correcting. She knew what would happen if the police came along looking for an African-American man. Her entitlement was threatened, but not only was her entitlement threatened, it was threatened by a person who she considered inferior to her. In her view, this man stepped out of his place. She wanted to put him back in his place. Many people are drawing comparisons to Emmett Till, and rightly so. Things haven't changed. James, if the last few months have illustrated anything, it's how amazing it is that some white people honestly believe it's their job to police Black Americans in their vicinity while simultaneously breaking the law themselves. Actually, I read a pretty large Twitter thread today about somebody who's from the South and is actually part of the, what they would call the Cavalier class. And this is all the folks who are descended from slave owners, basically, and how the former slave owning class is extremely, while we think of folks in Alabama as backwards and hickish or what have you. I mean, I know lots of folks in Alabama who are great. So, and actually, James, you went to school in Alabama. There are plenty of great Alabamans, but this person is talking specifically about the stereotype that is portrayed in a lot of conversations in media about the right wing down there. And this Twitter thread was about the fact that he, as a member of this upper crust, which derives all of its power, all of its wealth from generational wealth transfers from the slave era. This thread was about how everything they do, their entire political agenda, which is deep, well thought out, and hidden behind the far-right hillbilly movement, if you will, which acts as a shield for their refined interests, which is then to reestablish the Confederacy. Not reestablish the Confederacy insofar or by means of segregating or separating the southern states from the United States. It is much more insidious and well thought out than that. It is to bring Confederate culture and Confederate ways of living and a Confederate stratification of society, that is to say, a society of slavery, a society of white over minority, a society of their privilege protected, to bring that to the United States as a whole. And a lot of folks have made the observation that the North won the Civil War, but, well, that the North won the battle, but the South is winning the war, and that the North basically gave up fighting after the Civil War was concluded, but the South has kept fighting for generations. And this was exactly this person's point. And I think it is sort of insidious, but you see it all around us. And Donald Trump's presidency has really brought out a lot of folks' hidden Confederate, their hidden belief that, you know, they are in a position to lord it over others, or in a position to express that they have more rights than another person who, you know, is in theory an American citizen, a human being. And there are a lot of reasons to believe that, yeah, the South is winning this cultural war, and that we are regressing pretty rapidly towards a country that's dominated by that worldview. We'll see what ends up happening in 2020. I think that's going to be an important battle. But again, the war is not won by winning an election. The war is won through education, through a more equal distribution of resources, so that you don't have the lower classes fighting each other when their attention should be focused on the fact that that corporations are becoming arbiters of truth, that landholders are runting people into oblivion, and that it just so happens everybody, or the vast majority of folks who happen to hold that wealth, got it through intergenerational wealth transfer, which, you know, whether or not they are rich, debt was not passed on, or meager, but, you know, some degree of wealth was passed on, be it through a starter home that became a nicer home, that became a home in the suburbs, or through savings, or through college education that was afforded. You know, all of these things stack up over time through having better housing, access to housing, because they weren't redlined out of communities. There's just so much that needs to be done to correct some of the institutional inequities of the system. And the goal of so many right now is to preserve that bifurcation and that unequal structure so that they can continue to experience privilege at the expense of others. Okay. Deidre Levy comments. Copwatch.com. There are different neighborhoods that participate in Copwatch. Thank you, Deidre. Deidre was actually the one who sent the article about the school thing, which we're going to get to in a second, and then that'll be the last thing we talk about. Let's just get through these comments. This is a very, I like to address the comments, of course, and this is a pretty, it's a very personal matter for me. I get kind of emotional about it. I don't know if it presents, but like, you know, obviously I'm of mixed race, and my parents went through a lot of stuff. And yeah, if you're a minority, you've experienced racism at some point. It's pretty shitty. Julian Ballington, New Yorkers like to pretend that there are not race. Oh, New Yorkers like to pretend that they are not racist, but they are. Many people like to point to the South as racist, and yes, it is. But this isn't a regional problem; it is an American problem. During slavery, New Yorkers made money off the slave trade on Wall Street. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the South. There were slaves in some of the northern states, and the Emancipation Proclamation did not free them. That being said, I will also say that I've been all over this country, like a lot of places, and I have encountered the most racist person I've ever met here in New York City. So it's certainly not unique to the South, but it's also not unique to white people. There are lots of interracial animosities between Hispanics and blacks, Asians and blacks. It's just a huge mess. But the majority population, which happens to be the most privileged and the one that has, generally speaking, the most resources and generational wealth, hand-downs, which are white folks, they're the ones who benefit from all of the most. They benefit the most from all of the interracial animosity and this hierarchy that's been established based on nothing other than color, which is just absolutely ludicrous and ridiculous. But reinforced, of course, by economic inequality and access to things like financial institutions, access to good neighborhoods, to education, to clean water. I mean, think about what just a little bit of lead in your water does to an entire community of people who can't leave that area. They essentially have physical and mental damage done, like chemically. It stunts growth and development, and it prevents that community from ever living up to its maximum potential. And yet we allow the governments in some places like Michigan to ruin water supplies, ruin the quality of the land, so that people who are already put upon will not even be able to challenge the prevailing power structure. Julian, I think all of the normal avenues are dead. I honestly don't know what else to do. Not only did Amy Cooper attempt to kill a black man, not only is Ahmaud Arbery dead, but not only is George Floyd, dead, but a black woman was shot dead in her own home. This is, remember her name? I remember her name. It's Breonna. Breonna, can't remember the last name. Taylor? It's Breonna. This is the one in St. Louis. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, Breonna. There. No, it was in the next sentence. Man. But a black woman was shot dead in her own home. Breonna Taylor. It was Breonna Taylor. I swear to God, I didn't read ahead. It jumped my memory. Breonna Taylor was shot dead in her own home because the police couldn't be bothered to do their job correctly. Just to recap what happened there, it was a no-knock warrant on the other side of town, and they just broke into this home, again, without a warrant, wrong house. Somebody in the home who had a licensed firearm shot at these plainclothes police. Again, no identification, no knock, and they shot back just wildly, missing him, but hitting somebody in the bedroom, Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was shot dead in her own home because the police couldn't be bothered to do their job correctly. It seems clear to me that the police don't give a F about black lives. If they did, Eric Garner would be alive, George Floyd would be alive, Breonna Taylor would be alive. If the police cared about black lives, then it wouldn't have taken 2 months for Ahmaud Arbery's killers to be arrested. Replying to James Morris King, I thought about this as Ben was speaking. Short of complete revolt against the police, I honestly don't know anything else will work. The answer, okay, so update actually from Minneapolis, and this is important, and I had forgotten to mention this, but it is important to say, the police officers involved in George Floyd's death, all 4 of them have been fired. Now, honestly, going back to Michael Brown in St. Louis, like, that dragged on forever. There was review, this, that, and the other. There has actually been some positive movement on this. And you can tell because these police officers weren't put on probation. They weren't put under investigation. They weren't put on leave with pay. They were immediately fired. This is actually a step forward. It sounds absolutely ridiculous to say that we can point to this and say this is a demonstrable step in the right direction, but it is. But it is. That is why you have people flipping out about Amy Cooper, because it has taken this much. It has taken this much to get to a point where when police officers on tape in cold blood kill somebody, you can expect them to be fired the same day. Now, I don't think firing them is enough. I think there needs to be an investigation. The FBI is investigating. There should be a trial. They should be charged. Certainly the officer who kneeled on him should be charged with first or at least second-degree murder. The other officers as accomplices or at least manslaughter. This is not the end. It is the beginning. But it is probably the best beginning we've had in one of these cases ever. which was to say the immediate firing of 4 officers involved in the case. Hopefully, this is a trend that we can follow forward and doesn't experience a relapse. But all of these things are 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But all of that depends on who is in charge of the police force. And so, short of complete revolt against the police, we need a complete revolt at the ballot box. We need people voting. And, Black folks are the backbone of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party owes them more. Joe Biden owes them more. He owes them a police reform platform. He owes them honest discussion on this matter, and he owes them a Voting Rights Act restored and a Department of Justice that's going to take these things seriously, and new guidelines for how DOJ will investigate and what the FBI's mandate will be in labeling hate crimes, even when it overlaps with law enforcement, so like other the local law enforcement. Revolting against the police is, generally speaking, a hard thing to do, although they're doing it in Hong Kong. But going to vote is something that is easy and we can all do to make a difference. We just have to make sure that we demand from our politicians more, that we demand police chiefs and police leadership and executives who are going to recognize these problems and do something about it. Julian Ballington. Apparently Amy Cooper is a liberal. I didn't read the link, but just saw it on Twitter. Yes, I saw that too. And ultimately all this tells us is that, what kind of liberal? There's a million different types of liberals, and it's just meaningless to say that somebody's a liberal these days. Like, she opposes Donald Trump. Yeah, everybody opposes Donald Trump. It doesn't mean that they're not privileged. There's all sorts of reasons to be left of center these days, and there are lots of great progressives out there who just aren't. It's sad, but ultimately that's the truth. So finally, let's get to the situation on the schools, have a little discussion about that, and then I'm going to go have some beans. But basically, there was an op-ed, which again, Deidre sent. Thank you, Deidre. Talking about how coronavirus should be an opportunity to reform the New York City high school system. Now, to give you a little sense of what this is about and why this is important, the high school system in New York is not like many other high school systems. In New York City, when you go to high school, you don't necessarily go to a zone school. Zone schools exist, and whether you get into another school, you will still be given a place to attend, but about a third of all high schools are screened, which is to say you apply and they determine based on a set of criteria which they set whether or not to accept you. It's a little bit of the charter school sort of system where they're like, oh, it's selective acceptance, but that is how the New York City school system is set up. And so to give you a full overview, in the New York City high school system, there are 8 schools which are test-in only, right? The top 3 of those are Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech. You take an exam. Based on your score, you get into one of those 3 schools. And then there are 8 other schools which are also test-in. No, not 8 other schools, 5 other schools which are also test-in, 1 in each borough. Then there is LaGuardia High School of the Performing Arts, which requires you to do an artistic thing, to perform or submit paintings or whatever I call it superpower. Whatever your superpower is, you have to demonstrate it. And then there is the regular high school system, but a third of that is screened, and the screenings might be based on your grades. They might have their own exam, which is taken into consideration with your grades, your attendance, your punctuality, all of these things. And then there are schools that have portfolios, so they ask you to submit, an essay or artwork that you've done or a thesis or what have you, right? So that's how the New York City public school system is set up. And when you leave middle school to go to high school, you are meant to tour high schools, find one that is the best fit for you, and you're given a book that's like this. Or at least when I was a kid, you got a book like this. Now it's all online. I think you still get the book, though, that tells you about all of the schools, what their strengths are, how they operate, how many students go there. And then you're meant to do it sort of like college, like a pre-college sort of deal. And then you apply. You apply to schools and see whether they select you. The op-ed basically said that this is wildly unequal. It gives, very much like college admissions, a disproportionate preference to families that are wealthy, that have resources to pay for tutors, that have resources to pay for extracurricular activities that hone these superpowers, as I call them, these artistic talents. And it gives, it privileges people who have good middle schools, because punctuality, attendance, your grades, all of these things are closely correlated with how good your school actually is and the resources that it actually has and what it provides you. So, all fairly valid ideas. The article said that because coronavirus has made it impossible to create the metrics, or basically impossible to create the metrics on which schools rely. For example, there is no attendance, there is no punctuality. Grades are completely up in the air this year because nobody's really in school. How are we supposed to get a sense of attainment when we don't have people in the classroom? They said that this is an opportunity for all of their schools to, one, publish new rubrics that break from previous rubrics that were discriminatory, and then ideally move towards complete abolition of the screening process, so that there would be no screens on any schools in New York. All right. This is exceedingly controversial. This is exceedingly controversial because the screening system and the testing system, and this article didn't address the test in specialized high schools, but the implications are clear. It's very controversial because this system has produced, for some, incredibly good outcomes. And one of the arguments for not having these magnet schools, or this tracking, or this segregation of high attainers and low attainers, or however you want to view it, is that students who do worse perform better when put in the same setting as high achieving students. And so everybody should just basically be mixed together effectively in their zone school, or at random. Ideally at random, because all you'll get in the long run, if you do the zoning thing, is good zones and bad zones as people shift their residences to find the better school districts, which is, by the way, something that already happens. School District 2 is extremely wealthy, and surprise, surprise, there's a bunch of good schools there. That being said, this is a very hard problem. The magnet school system was set up to desegregate because you had all of these schools that were based on zone and based on school districts, which were controlled by school boards. And the magnet school idea was to allow high achievers, regardless of where they happen to live, to move around the city to receive a better education. Now, again, if you abolish that and everybody goes to their local school, you might once more have the shifting around of families to find the better schools. And as long as you allow supplementary fundraising for schools, and then try and even out the city funding, the government funding, you're going to have schools with more resources and fewer resources. And this is going to lead again to more segregation, or more unequal outcomes. So, honestly, I read the op-ed and I didn't think it was, I didn't find it very compelling. There were no specific suggestions made. And as I'm highlighting the difficulties in this, it's just such a nuanced topic. And then again, you have these successful outcomes from these magnet schools and from the specialized high schools that produce very high achievers. I mean, I went to Bronx Science, for example, and I remember going to the University of Michigan, which was supposedly a really good school. And one of my friends in senior year asked me, he was like, Ben, why isn't this class kicking your ass like it's kicking my ass? And I was like, I don't know. I went to really good schools. Like, I was weeded out. I was constantly being selected for and constantly being forced to like study and try and jump through all these hoops. And so honestly, I found my college experience significantly easier than my high school experience. And maybe to some extent, like on par with my middle school experience. So these very rigorous academic institutions produce really high quality results. But again, you have this problem where not everybody has access to them. And I would be absolutely, remiss in not saying that, yeah, my high school and my middle school were not super diverse. They certainly didn't have populations that reflected the population of New York City as a whole. But I think it's very, very, there are some school districts like School District 15, CEC 15 in Brooklyn, which have abolished entirely all screenings in their schools. I think it's going to be very interesting. And by the way, that's a district which includes Park Slope and Sunset Park. So two very different communities based on, socioeconomically and ethnically. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in these experiments. But simply abolishing all screening, I don't know how useful that will ultimately, how useful that would ultimately be. I think you're going to end up with a lot of other knock-on effects that were not mentioned or anticipated in the op-ed. And ultimately, what we really want to achieve is personalized education. And in the COVID era, I actually think that maybe if we're going to talk about the future of education and how to get everybody a good education, if we're going to have a significant amount of remote and distance learning to thin out the populations in schools and get class sizes down because you need to have the social distancing, this might be an excellent time to start experimenting with taking your high-performing teachers, letting them teach more students in a mass setting, and using other teachers as basically in a TA model. So you'll have group settings, which are asynchronous with the main lecture, where you'll have somebody doing something that is appropriate for a large number of children. And it will be your top performing teachers, your very best, your cream of the crop. And then those teachers will be spread around the city. And all of the other teachers will be there to provide constant support and regular interaction with students in their districts. And even when if we move back to an in-school model, one of the models is half week in, half week out, so that you can have, again, half the school population in an indoor class environment at a time, again, to thin out that population to get the social distancing. If we move to a model like that, where half of the components are online and half of the components are in class, then it makes a lot more sense to have specialized teachers who are good at specific things, who can move around the city, and to not make education so dependent on geography, not by trying to bus 100,000 kids across the city, but by paying teachers better and giving them the resources they need to teach remotely, and then on a schedule, move around the city doing reverse magnet programs, if you will, where they're drawn to pockets of children in need for a specific skill set. And then, you have your local teachers who have regular interaction, the teachers that students know, but then you have specialists. And, in the COVID era, I think we should go beyond trying to rethink our school building based school system and start thinking about how we can make resources available to everyone using technology in a way that we just didn't have the buy-in to invest in before. In any event, that's a thought. Maybe I should write an op-ed. In any event, let's see what we got in terms of comments on this. Oh, there's only one. Julianne. Yes, but I think it's important to address racism in liberal circles. You know what I'm talking about. I do know what you're talking about. I guess we're going back. Well, actually, this is about all things, right? Like we spoke about that in regards to Amy Cooper, who is a liberal, but also we can talk about that in terms of the New York City police force, which is a liberal city that has a problem with excessive force when it comes to the police interacting with minority populations. We can talk about it in terms of schools, where we have liberals who really believe that they're not racist, but are reinforcing a system of inequity, not because they wouldn't view it as racist, but they want to protect their privilege, or they want to use their privilege to make sure that their children get ahead through tutoring, through supplementary funds for their schools, and not fundraising, say, for schools that have less, or just allowing all schools to have equal funding from the government without their involvement. Really, if we're going to raise money for schools, there should be some degree to which it's put into a central pot and everybody benefits, because everybody needs resources. Everybody could use more. And we're going to see a reduction in education funding because of the pandemic, something to the tune of forget what it was, like 7 million, just devastating cuts all across the city and really all across the country. Julianne, let's see what we got here. I disagree with your idea. There needs to be a small classroom, but having additional help is a great idea. Many students need individualized attention. There needs to be more than one teacher in a classroom. Well, I'm not saying that there wouldn't be more than one teacher in a classroom, but I am saying that we know for a fact that there's going to be situations where students aren't in classrooms. There aren't going to be these full classrooms for a while, probably, if people do it right, because one, right now we're doing distance learning, and two, everything we've seen from other countries is not returning to full capacity of schools. In order to maintain social distancing between children, you need to have smaller populations of kids in the building. Because right now we have rooms and you try to cram in 30 or 40 kids, and they are maybe 2 feet apart if you're lucky. If we're going to try and achieve 6 feet of distance, we're not going to be able to put every kid into school at the same time. One, this reduces the class size and allows teachers to give people more individual attention. But two, in a remote situation, you can have asynchronous learning, so that there are large classes that are done with the specialists or with your top teachers, and then breakout sessions where not everybody has to be in a breakout session at the same time. Some can go do work, others can be with teachers online. And that way you can get class size down while keeping your staff size the same. And the very best teachers can be made available to students anywhere in the city. Let's see. Technology does not replace an in-classroom experience, especially for students with disabilities, younger students, and everyone. There is no replacement for connecting in a classroom. Learning is a multi-sensory experience. I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying that you also can't have full classrooms. And so unless we, let's say that we wanted to, I guess we have 3 options. One, we could ignore coronavirus or cure coronavirus. That would be the best, I think, because we all just want this problem to go away. 2, we're going to have to do what they're doing in other countries and social distance while we try to return to normal. And that means we have to reduce the number of kids in a classroom. That can be accomplished in one of 2 ways. Not having kids there, doubling the real estate that the school system uses in New York City. The latter is almost financially impossible. Doubling real estate's expensive. Although there's going to be all this excess commercial space, maybe it's possible. Who knows? But given things as they are, it's extremely unlikely that, particularly with budget cuts, that we're going to get more school buildings, that we're going to get more classrooms, which means that you have to keep some number of kids out of school at any given time, even if others return, right? So what they're doing in Singapore and in other places is a week on, a week off, or they're doing half days, half, or they're doing one day alternating days, right? So while of course you want kids to have interactions with other human beings, we are going to have a situation where even when you're in school, you have to, ideally, people are going to keep some distance from each other. And actually that sort of reduces a lot of the multi-sensory capacity that you were talking about, because now you actually have to be a distance from the teacher. There's going to be significantly less hands-on activities and sharing of things like manipulatives or games and such. But let's see, Deirdre says, some schools in Brooklyn were considering partial days off, half-day sessions to ensure proper social distancing. Indeed. Deirdre goes on, technology can be a supplement, but not the whole day. If we are going to continue remote learning, it is important to equip or train parents how to help their children. And yes, I absolutely agree with that. And, we're going to have a real problem with parents as well, because parents rely on schools to allow them to leave and go to work. Once the economy, I suppose what we're admitting here is that in a half day or 1 week on, 1 week off scenario, we have not returned to normal, and we're not going to return to normal. And so it's likely that a lot of parents will be staying at home and working remotely as well. But on the other hand, all of our essential workers are out there. What are their kids doing, right? When they're not home to take care of them, hiring childcare. As the economy opens, more and more people and more families are going to be in that situation. So actually, there's a huge logistical hurdle here, which we haven't even addressed, which is also heavily rooted in current inequities and ethnic disparities. It's like who does what job and who's going to get to stay home with their kids, and who's going to be able to provide that added attention, even as schools have to be partially empty. So nailing down remote learning in the best way possible, I think, is really critical. And again, for me, I think one thing to explore is centralizing the talent of teachers, as opposed to saying every school is on its own. We can have the most experienced, the most engaged, and the best teachers at online doing the remote learning for a lot of students, freeing up other students to provide online simultaneous support in breakout rooms or answer questions that students have, so that there's a division of labor and you get that class size down even online. I think there's a potential here for improving the scale at which we deliver education, which actually is really interesting. And maybe I will write an op-ed, because the more I think about it, the more the op-ed that Deirdre shared is really stuck in the past. It's a model of like, how can we use the pandemic to change the way that education is delivered without changing the way that people access education, without changing the way that education is delivered. And really what we should be asking is, given the pandemic, how are we going to change the delivery of education? And if we're going to change that delivery, what does it look like to make a delivery service that is completely agnostic to ethnicity and socioeconomic background, so that everybody has equal access? Of course, then we get into all these things about like the digital divide and all that and such. So, these are not easy questions. These are huge questions. Unfortunately, we're just forced to grapple with them. In any event, we've been talking now for a long, long time. My hair is all in my eyes because it's dried now, as promised, and I got to go eat something. So I hope to see you all again tomorrow at 8:30. I'll see you then. Oh, and if you have things you want me to talk about, please do send articles, because obviously when you do, I'm happy to discuss. See you later. Wait, is this something I missed? Nope. Read that comment. All right. Tomorrow at 8:30, folks.